Well, hi everyone, and welcome to another fun-filled edition of Adam's Music Box. The other day, I talked about Wolfman Jack, one of the first and one of the best rock and roll and soul DJs of all time. And he paved the way for a generation of DJs who came out of the late 60s and 70s who really pioneered FM radio. Because when Wolfman started, and much like Art Laboe and Casey Kasem, it was all AM. FM was this thing, and no one really knew what to do with it. But by the late 60s, this stereophonic, high quality sounding radio format, who didn't have many stations, it was beginning to come into its own. It was the wild, wild west of radio. And a new generation of FM DJs took to freeform broadcasting where they didn't have a playlist. They were never told what to do by management. They were very freewheeling with their philosophies and their ideas and their politics and their personal stories, and they wove this into the music that they loved. Many of them in the early days were even playing their own record collections as opposed to a library and catalog that was owned by a major radio station. Now, one of the great DJs who started in this underground freeform style and hit the big time without ever sacrificing that freeform style was Jim Ladd. And he was someone who was absolutely beloved by the musicians that he'd interview and by the musicians whose music he'd play. He's, of course, sitting at his home in the Laurel Canyon area of Los Angeles with the great Tom Petty, who himself in the early 2000s wrote a song about Ladd called The Lost DJ, who plays what he wants to play, says what he wants to say. That was all about Jim Ladd. And when Jim first heard the song, he had no idea it was about him, but someone told him, no, Tom wrote that song about you. And that wasn't the only time he was embraced by artists. He interviewed a lot of his friends. He was friends with all of the surviving members of the Doors and interviewed Manzarek, Krieger, and Densmore many times, friends with Jackson Brown, did some great interviews with the wonderful Warren Zevon. He not only interviewed Roger Waters many times about politics and about life over the years, but was featured on the 1987 Roger Waters album Radio Chaos, Kaos, like a call sign of a West Coast USA radio station. And he even went on tour with Roger and did the emceeing of the show in this character based on a kind of apathetic DJ, which was the opposite of what Ladd was. Ladd was a deeply empathetic DJ, but that was the point that he and Roger were making on that album. He began his career with very openly stated views about his opposition to the war in Vietnam. And in the lost part of his career, the lost quarter of his career, if you will, he was talking all about the Vietnam, sorry, Freudian slip, all about the Iraq War, interviewing artists like Neil Young and John Fogerty, formerly of Creedence Clearwater Revival, who wrote anti-war songs in the Iraq era. When I was in LA and Sid Barrett died, it was listening to Jim Ladd that I first heard that news. Same with John Entwistle of The Who. So he was really there at the beginning, middle, and end of so many great musical lives, so many great musical stories. He was someone who created what he called the theater of the mind with his music. Whether it was his show headsets, his regular late night sets, he called it a gathering of the tribe. He didn't have listeners, he had a tribe. And it was really quite amazing that he was able to do this, especially in hindsight, on commercial radio. Through the most of the 70s and into the 80s, he was with KMET, the Mighty Met, a progressive and album-oriented rock station in LA. Then he moved back to KLOS after 87. They fired him in 2011 very unceremoniously, and the conservative AM talk radio station KFI allowed him to do a final broadcast. And he remarked that it's quite funny how what goes around comes around, and that at the end of the day, it's really just about people. And you can find good people in that corporate radio world, but sadly, especially after the 90s, when the FCC under Clinton deregulated a lot of radio, it really did become a corporate horror show. But Ladd hung on for a long time, even after that. Then He went to Sirius XM, the satellite radio station, before being fired from that, or not fired, but curtailed. They curtailed his airtime. And during the time after Jim Ladd's death, around Christmas of last year, Roger Waters, who eulogized his great friend online, said that he was planning on starting a radio station with some sort of online and global presence with Jim Ladd, because Sirius, which claimed to be a sort of bastion of free speech, turned out not to be quite as free speech orientated for Jim Ladd as it is for some others, at least according to Roger, and I have no reason to doubt that. He was the voice of a generation. And I know that sounds cliched, but he really was. And he spanned generations. And all of the musicians from Guns N' Roses slash went to his Hollywood Walk of Fame ceremony to the guys from Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, to John Lennon, who he interviewed, to so many. They all loved Jim Ladd, and so say all of us. So, my little new YouTube channel wasn't even born when Jim died almost half a year ago. But because we've been talking about great radio DJs, I wanted to salute the lost DJ. Like, subscribe, and we will see you next time. Take care.